Everyone, thank you for your patience and welcome to the webinar titled How to Load Data More Quickly and Accurately into Oracle's Life Sciences Data Hub, presented by Perficient's Catherine Hansen, who is a solutions architect in our life sciences practice. My name is Eugene Stefanoff. I am the marketing manager for our life sciences practice. Before I turn it over to Catherine, I'd like to cover some basic housekeeping items and then provide a brief overview of our company. So all participants on this call will be in listen-only mode. This means that everyone is on mute. You are welcome to submit questions to the speaker at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please do make sure you state your questions clearly and keep in mind that other webinar participants will not see your questions or comments. However, they will be anonymously addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you have unanswered questions or would like to request additional information about our services, you're always welcome to fill out the contact forms found on our website. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to you within several days along with a link to the slides. All right, now that I've covered the logistics, let's move on to a quick overview of Perficient. We are an IT and management consulting company that offers a variety of IT solutions for several industries, including, of course, life sciences, as well as healthcare, financial services, consumer products, and several others. We have employees in offices all over the world, including the locations that you see on this slide here. And as you may expect, most of our clients are based in North America and Europe. This slide here contains a bunch of facts about Perficient. Just to point out a few, we were founded in 1997. We are a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ. And lastly, at the moment, we have a little bit over 2,500 employees. So what is it that Perficient really does? We essentially do everything. So we offer our clients many different types of digital experience, business optimization, technology solutions, and that spans anything from business process management and information management to content management systems, all the way to portals. But since most of you guys on this call are part of the clinical IT sphere, I'll just mention what it is we do when it comes to life sciences specific IT applications. So as you can see, we cover the data management and EDC space, safety and pharmacovigilance, clinical trial management, data warehousing, analytics, as well as precision medicine. And as far as services go, we provide what you would typically expect from other IT services companies. That's consulting, implementations, upgrades, cloud hosting, support, project management, and so on and so forth. All right, now that I've covered the housekeeping items, I would now like to turn the call over to Catherine Hansen.
Thank you, Eugene, and welcome everyone. I really appreciate your taking the time out of your busy day to attend this presentation on loading data into the Life Sciences Hub Clinical Data Warehouse. Eugene has thoughtfully let me cover a quick introduction to myself, so I'll take care of that. He did mention that Perficient pretty much does everything, but my title is a little bit more limiting. I am, my official title is Solutions Architect in the Life Sciences portion of Perficient. And what a solutions architect typically means is that I help companies like yours implement practical solutions to help you solve your business and technology problems. As you can see, I've been doing this for quite a while. 20 years is actually a little bit of an understatement. I've probably been doing it closer to 25 years. And I've worked in many parts of this life sciences industry. I worked with preclinical services, clinical services. I've worked with manufacturing, So I have a lot of good experience with the life sciences industry. One thing I do know, however, is that I'm constantly learning and learning more about the life sciences industry. So that's what I hope that I can help you with today, is to learn some more about the life sciences industry and how we can help you. I do have currently a Perficient of focus on clinical data warehousing, data analytics, and precision medicine applications. And the focus in today's topic is clinical data warehousing and marginally leading into analytics as well. As I was preparing this presentation today, I started to think about how to organize it. And I was actually looking for some really clever way of introducing the topic. And I know that some speakers will start with a joke or something like that, but I'm really not very good at starting with jokes, and even if I could think of one, I would have prepared it rather badly. So while I was waiting for some kind of brilliant insight on how to lead you into this topic, I actually started to procrastinate a bit and was going through my overfilled email inbox. And one thing immediately I started to notice was that I had a number of invitations to conferences. I had a number of invitations to download white papers. I had a number of invitations for this, that, and the other. And I just so happened to notice that many of those had to do with the same themes and topics. And so I took that to be a clear sign that should be a lead-in to my discussion today. So my lead-in to the discussion today is what's trending in technology. And more specifically, when I get further into this presentation, what's trending in technology for the life sciences industry. So just representatively from my inbox, I noticed that there were a couple trending topics. So we obviously have the topic of big data. You can't help but notice lots of conversations on web blogs and various other places, big data. How do we acquire data from all these sources? How do we manage high volume data? Now, obviously, when we're talking about the life sciences industry, we're not talking about the high volume of data that the Googles or the Amazons or the Facebooks are processing on a regular basis. But nonetheless, I think we all recognize that in a typical phase 3 trial that's running over an extended period of time, we're talking about some pretty high volumes of data. And in particular, that data has certain constraints and requirements that we don't see in other industries. So big data, how do we acquire data, and how do we manage a high volume of data? That seemed to be a trending topic that was interesting to life sciences as well. There is a lot of conversation about data privacy and security. I don't think we can go by a week or a month without hearing about some security breach at some company, how they've been compromised, how their data has been exposed, either via hackers or because it's been lost on a laptop or for whatever other reasons. So data privacy and security is extremely important, especially to the life sciences industry. How can we control who has access to our data to make sure that we control it in a regulatory compliant fashion? And then finally, a topic which is particularly dear to my heart is data analytics. If we've gone to the trouble of acquiring data and high volume of data, and if we're managing our privacy and security adequately, finally, we need to make some valid use of all this data. We need to be able to draw conclusions on that data, to notice trends, and to identify patterns. So big data, data privacy, data analytics, these are all topics that I saw in web conferences that I had been invited to white papers that I was invited to download. So we are seeing many of these same trending topics in the life sciences industry. So they're not specific to, for example, the manufacturing industry, which is concerned with inventory control. They're not specific to anybody else, as they're also very specific to the life sciences industries. We need to be able to acquire data from external sources as well. More and more today, our life sciences companies are outsourcing the collection and management of clinical data to external sources, to CROs. We need to be able to receive that data from those sources. We need to be able to receive data from central laboratories, for example. So there are a lot of external sources we need to be able to acquire data from and to be able to manage that data. Some of the data we're receiving, and it's going to be high volume. Again, a large phase 3 trial with thousands of subjects being conducted over the course of several years. If we're collecting laboratory data, if we're collecting, for example, questionnaire data, there is a very good potential that data is going to grow and grow in size, possibly reaching many gigabytes before the study is finally complete. So high volume, while it's relative, is still an important factor for the life sciences industry. Once we've acquired that data, how can we present that data for analysis? Acquiring the data by itself is not the end, is not the goal of what we're trying to do. We're trying to be able to present that data for analysis, to be able to determine trends, to find patterns, and so we need to be able to make sure that that data is available in a timely fashion. And then finally, but not least, is how can we secure that data against unauthorized access? We don't want to be part of the headlines. We don't want to breach our security and have unauthorized folks access that private clinical data. So the big question is, and that's the main focus of this conversation today, is how can we, the life sciences industry, acquire and manage the data we receive from many different sources? Usually when I'm discussing, problems and discussing solutions to those problems, the first thing I recommend is that we identify what we'd like to see in an ideal solution. That will give us the criteria we need to evaluate the possible solutions and to pick the one that will best meet our needs. So in this slide, I'd like to discuss some of the things I think we'd like to see in an ideal solution for collecting data from external sources. First off, I think that an ideal solution should be as much hands-off as possible and should be as automated as possible. Once the system is set up and once it's running in a fairly consistent fashion, I really don't want to have to do much more with it other than monitor it on a regular basis, monitor its performance, and occasionally fix occasional hiccups and glitches. So it should be hands-off and automated as possible, especially after the initial setup. My ideal solution should definitely be flexible. One of the things we constantly learn in this industry, and others as well, is that our needs change over time. Data changes over time, processes change over time, regulations change over time. If I have a system that's not flexible, that can't adapt to those changes, then I'm going to find myself in the mode of always having to patch that system together, to put in hard code changes to it, to do actually have a lot of manual effort that I should not have to have in a system that is more flexible and more adaptable. So I want a system that's flexible. I want it to be able to adapt as my data changes over time. I want it to be able to handle multiple different file types. Today, for example, for this year, I might be receiving data as in SAS transport format. For another type of data, maybe for central labs, I want to be able to receive data in an ASCII text file. So my flexible system should be able to handle all different kinds of file types. An ideal system is flexible in the fact that I might want to choose to start other jobs when a data file has been loaded and that load is successful. So, for example, if I'm loading data from my CRO, and that's raw clinical data, and I have a series of programs or an application that transforms that data to a standard format, I might want to be able to trigger that transformation job automatically every time the raw data load is completed. That way, the data will be readily available for analysis since that transformation program is going to be running in an automated fashion as well. So those are some examples of flexibility. I'm sure you can think of others, but those are the ones I'm probably going to address in this conversation. My ideal solution should definitely be reliable and secure. As you know, there are a lot of regulations that define what we can do with the data, how we have to secure the data, how we have to maintain the data. and how we have to prove to regulatory agencies that we are doing that. So my system should have those things built in. It should be reliable, it should be secure, it should maintain a reliable and secure audit trail, it should be accountable. All the things we're used to doing on a regular basis with other applications, we should be able to do with an automated file load utility as well. My system should be efficient. It should perform well on high volume data. If I'm receiving data from many different sources, from many different clinical trials on a regular basis, I really would not like to have to wait hours or even days perhaps to get that data into my warehouse and to get it available for analysis. So my system should be efficient and it should perform well. And finally, my system should be as simple, and I should say as simple as possible to implement. I'm looking for a solution that is not complex, that is not overly difficult to implement. It doesn't require a lot of maintenance and monitoring. So it should be simple to implement. This diagram is a high-level overview of what this ideal solution would typically do in a set of high-level steps. I'll go into some of these in more detail later in the presentation, but just to give you an overview of what a file load utility should do for me. The concept here is that I will be receiving a data file from an external source, whether it's a CRO or a central lab or some other data source. I have a secure file transfer mechanism, and I'm receiving files from those external sources. Those files are being loaded into a secure staging area in my company. So my system administrators and other folks have set up a secure staging area for me. So in step number 1, the data file is loaded into that secure staging area. In step number 2, I'd like my system to perform some QC checks on that data before it starts to hit the warehouse. I want to make sure that the file meets a certain number of minimum requirements. Does the file follow certain naming conventions? Is the file of the right data type? Does the file even contain data? A number of pre-processing checks will make sure that the data is going to be complete and correct by the time it hits the warehouse. In step number 3, the file load utility actually takes over. The quality assurance checks have been met, and the file load utility starts to process the data in the data file. It basically extracts each of the data sets from that data file, does its own processing on them to determine the file formats and the data structures, and in the end, in step number 4, it loads that data into a staging area in my warehouse. Once that data has been loaded into my warehouse in that staging area, it's then going to be available to other processes that are going to be using and consuming that data. So for example, I might be using a data mapper to transform that data, or I might have SAS programs that transform that data into standard structures. Once that data has been transformed into standard structures, I could have analysis programs that are using that data to determine patterns and identify patterns and trends in the data. So as a high-level series of steps, I load the data file into a secure staging area. I perform some pre-processing checks to make sure the file is qualified. I hand that file over to the file load utility, which processes it, extracts the data, and loads the data into a staging area in the warehouse. So if I'm trying to implement this ideal solution, what do I need to get started? What will start me with this file load utility? First of all, I need some kind of repository or clinical data warehouse that will receive and manage the clinical data. For this presentation, that's the Oracle Life Sciences Data Warehouse. It could be any data warehouse, however, because the Life Sciences Data Hub is especially engineered to perform in a regulatory compliant fashion. So that's the warehouse that I'm going to be talking about today. If you're not familiar with the Oracle Life Sciences Warehouse, I would refer you back to Eugene, and he would get you in touch with the right folks at Perficient and Oracle to give you more information on data warehousing. I also need to have the internal resources to set up and monitor the system. So I need system administrators, and I need network administrators, and the whole slew of those kinds of administrators who will install the application and monitor the system once it's been validated. I need a set of secure directories that are going to be used to receive and process the data files. Obviously, I need software. So I need the utility software that's going to process the files and load the data into the repository. For this file load utility, there are two basic kinds of software we're talking about. There is the Java programs that reside on the server that do the pre-processing and extract the data. And then there's also the PL/SQL programs that live in LSH that process that data and load it into the repository. So there's a number of different applications that need to be installed, and my internal resources will take care of that for me. I definitely need a way to register new data sources so that the utility recognizes new data sources and can process them. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. And finally, I need some sort of simple scheduling software that controls how these background processes and jobs will run, how frequently they will run, what kinds of error handling will be in place, and those kinds of things. And any kind of simple scheduling software, whether you have a commercial package, whether you write your own, anything will do in order to schedule these jobs to run. So basically, I need a repository, I need some directories and software, and I need to be able to register new sources. Once I have all of this set up, how do I actually begin loading data? We recommend, first of all, that you work with your vendor for a number of different reasons. First of all, we want you and the vendor to come to a common agreement about what the file format will be that you'll be receiving. And am I going to be receiving ASCII text files? Am I going to be receiving SAS data sets? Am I going to be receiving SAS transport formats? You both need to come to some agreement about what the file format will be. You as a company need to have some understanding of what data structures you'll be receiving. That's principally going to be based on what kind of data you're receiving, whether it's coming from an ECRF, whether it's coming from central labs, whether it's PK data. All those different data types are going to define the data structures that you'll be working with. You and the vendor need to come to a common understanding of some file naming conventions, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation, but it's something you need to agree on so that the file load utility can recognize files that are dropped into that secure staging area. You need to be able to provide secure access to that download area to your vendor so that only authorized folks and only authorized vendors will be able to drop files into that area. And you can use either a commercial package that manages secure file transport. You can build your own. We're not constraining you to any particular mechanism for downloading those files. It could be as simple as receiving a file in a secure FTP area. Nonetheless, you need to be able to provide some secure access to the download area. And finally, we recommend you receive a sample data file from the vendor. This will give you an opportunity to make sure that your agreement is valid, that you're receiving the right data file, the right data structures, the file naming conventions are being met. It will give you an opportunity to test the file load utility with each new data source. Once you and the vendor have come to those kinds of agreements, you'll need to register that new data source for the utility, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. So we register a new data source in the utility. We need to make sure that the storage areas that we need in the repository are defined, and I'll go into that in a bit. So we need to be able to load data. We need to be able to define a data source. We need to be able to set up our clinical data warehouse to receive that data. We need to run some tests on that sample data to make sure it loads correctly into the repository. And if it doesn't load correctly, then we need to go back and work more closely with the vendor to get that to work correctly. And then finally, we need to complete any other setup that will be needed so that authorized users can access that data once it's been loaded. So we might need to set up transformation programs to transform that data to standard structures. You might want to set up visualizations on that data so people can view it in visualization tools like JReview and TIBCO Spotfire. So any other work you need to do to provide access to that data needs to be done up front as well. I mentioned a couple of times previously that we need to set up secure directories for the file load utility. So let me talk about quickly what those directories are, and this will give you some insight as to the general processing that the file load utility will do for you. So under some root directory, somewhere on a back-end server, we have a series of folders that are being used to process the data. The first such folder is called the staging directory, and the data file that we receive from your vendor will be dropped into this watch directory. This is the directory where your back-end process that's monitoring the system, looking for dropped files, will search. So this is the watch directory. The files drop directly into that by your vendor. Once that file has been dropped into the staging directory and your back-end process has detected that a new data source has been added to that directory, the file load utility will take over and will move files from the staging directory to the processing directory, the second directory on the list there. So the pre-processed files that are extracted from the file that's been loaded are moved there for final processing and for eventual loading into the warehouse. So at some point in the processing, you'll see SAS datasets perhaps appearing in that process directory. You might see text files appearing in that directory. You'll see various supplementary files appearing in that process directory as well as the data file is being processed. After the data file is processed, it can move one of two places. The process can obviously fail for any number of reasons. Perhaps there's a problem with the data file itself. Maybe there's a problem with the data structures. There are a number of reasons why the file load might fail. If that file load fails, the data file is moved into a reject directory where it can be retrieved if necessary and possibly either sent back to the vendor for them to see what went wrong, or possibly for you to examine, or possibly even to resubmit once a problem has been resolved. So if the file load fails, it moves into the reject directory. If the file load succeeds, the files are moved into a success directory for archive purposes. And then finally, there is a scripts directory where the utility software is stored on the back end. So a number of important directories. Directories would be used typically by your systems administrator if they needed to use the job logs, for example. If they needed to retrieve a rejected file, for example, to send back to the vendor. If they wanted to retrieve a file that had been successfully loaded so that they could archive it off at the close of the study. So all these directories are there for systems administrators to access. I've mentioned several times that we need to be able to register a new data source with the file load utility. So this is a very simple process, actually. There's an Oracle table that can be accessed by the Life Sciences Data Hub, and that can be accessed by an authorized study administrator. The study administrator would typically create an entry in this table for each new data source for which you'll be receiving data. And there are quite a few attributes that need to be filled in this registration, and I'll cover some of them here and some of them a bit later. The first three attributes identify the study and the data type. So we need to be able to tell the file load utility what kind of data we're receiving. Is this test or production data? And we need to identify, is it lab data perhaps? Is it PK data? Those kinds of things. It's certainly entirely possible that you'll be receiving many different types of data for a single study. So the file load utility has been set up flexibly enough so that you can define one type of data for a study, or you can define 5 to 10 or to 20 different kinds of data that you're going to be receiving for a study. So the first three attributes are kind of the key into this Oracle table, and are what you'll see later will be the link between the file load utility and the repository. The next three attributes tell the utility where you're going to be storing that loaded data in the Oracle warehouse. So for LSH, for example, we need to define a study domain. a study application area, and a study work area. And so those three attributes define where the data will eventually be loaded when the file load utility successfully finishes. Skipping over a number of attributes, and some of those I'll discuss later, just an indication that there are lots of options in this registration that allow you to control how you want the data loaded. For example, there are options to control whether or not you're going to be managing a high volume of data, whether or not you're going to be receiving a text file, how that text file is formatting, and I'll go over some of those later as well. But just to point out, this file load utility is extremely flexible and provides lots of options for you to define per data file how that data should be loaded. So one data file might be high volume, labs for example, and you define it to do a high transactional throughput load. Another type of data might contain, another type of file might contain blinded data, and you want to let LSH know that it's going to be receiving blinded data. Lots of options here to help you manage every kind of data you might be receiving. And the final link between the file load utility and the warehouse are the naming conventions that are defined for the file you'll be receiving. A file that you'll be receiving for this file load utility must follow a defined naming convention, and that naming convention will point to or reference a specific entry in that registration table. So in this example, we are receiving a zip file, and it contains, as the first parameter, the study name. In this case, it's CDISCO1. So that's a clear indicator to the file load utility that should be looking for an entry in the registration table for that particular study. The next parameter is an indication of the type of data that will be loaded. In this case, the word full is indicating I'm receiving all data. It could be something that's labeled PK. It could be labeled lab. It could be labeled ECG. It could be labeled whatever you want, but it's an indicator that I'm loading a particular kind of data. If I'm loading 3 kinds of data for CDISCO1, I'm going to have 3 entries in my registration table, and that data type will be different for each of those. The next parameter is an indicator of whether this is going to be development, test, or production data. As I'm working with a new vendor to set up a file load, I probably will be in development mode. Once I've got that agreement with the vendor and things look like they're ready to go, I'm probably going to be running a load in test mode to make sure that the load is validated and ready for production. And finally, when everything is worked out and operating seamlessly, I'm probably going to have changed that to production so that I'm then directly loading data into production environment in LSH. Finally, we have a unique date and timestamp, which allows us to identify whether or not a data file has previously been loaded. So you can see that these set of entries here closely work with the study registration we talked about previously and gives the file load utility all the information it needs to locate an area in the warehouse in which to load data. Some of the other processing options we have are, some of them are quite interesting, others you might think they're pretty routine. In particular, I think the ability to run another job after my data successfully loads is an interesting feature. The example I gave before is probably this one I'm going to give again. If I'm loading raw data from a CRO, for example, for adverse events and concomitant medications and demography and all those ECRFs, what I typically might like to be able to do is to immediately transform that data into standard structures, whether it's SDPM standard structures or whether it's your own company's definition of standard structures. I would like to be able to transform that automatically so that the data is immediately available to authorized users for their review. So the ability to run another job after the file load utility finishes successfully is an extremely flexible and useful feature. I probably want to be able to specify to the file load utility and to the warehouse that I may be loading blinded data. Blinded data, as you know, has special and unique handling conditions, and I want to make sure that that data is identified properly is loaded properly and is constrained properly in my warehouse. So an option to be able to identify that data is extremely useful. I want to be able to send out notifications to various user groups when the file load utility finishes. If I'm receiving lots of files on a regular basis from many different vendors, I may want only error conditions to be sent to systems administrators so that they can monitor those error conditions and manage them appropriately. If I'm receiving data less frequently, perhaps on a monthly basis from a smaller number of vendors, I might want success notifications sent out to the study data managers so that they can be aware of the fact that new data has been received. So again, the utility will let you define what kinds of notifications you want sent out and to whom they should be sent. I want to have the option of processing large files. So the typical file load utility, by default, will load relatively large files. In LSH, that's usually somewhere under 4 to 5 gigabytes in size. If I'm going to be receiving files that are larger than that, I probably want to specify a different processing type so that the data is loaded more efficiently and quickly into LSH. So I want to have an option of setting a trigger that's going to say this is going to be a large data file, treated a little bit differently than some of the smaller data files I'm receiving. Interestingly, the next one I'm going to talk about a bit more, but I'll mention it here. I want to be able to manage changes in my data over time. I think we all recognize and understand that, particularly in long-running trials, sometimes the data structures change. Perhaps there's an amendment to the protocol that requires additional data to be collected on an ECRF. Perhaps I need to add an ECRF. For any number of reasons, the potential is always there to have data structures change over time. I want to make sure that my system is flexible enough to handle those changes without a whole lot of manual intervention. So I want to have the option of indicating to my file load utility that it can handle those kinds of changes. And I'll talk about that in a bit more. I want to be able to identify different kinds of file formats for text files. So for example, text files can be either delimited or fixed. If the text file is delimited, I want to be able to specify what the delimiter will be for that text file. I might want to specify what the enclosing characters are for those text files. All those kinds of features that I'm used to, for example, when I'm importing data into Excel or into any other application, I want to be able to specify those same kinds of options for text files in my autoload utility. So I can do that with some of the features that are there in the system. I also need to make sure that my repository is set up. So I've gone through all the work to work with my vendor. My vendor understands my data requirements, and I understand what the vendor is going to deliver to me. I've registered my study to the file load utility. Before I can start receiving those files, I need to set up my repository structures so that the work areas that I need to load that data into are there and are defined. On this particular example with the Life Sciences Data Hub, I have the domain that I've identified when I registered my study. I have the application area, CDisco1, that I used when I registered my study. And I have a work area for stage data that I used when I registered my study. And that definition right there means that when the utility loads data into that staged data warehouse, it's going to load it into the right place. So make sure your repository is set up first. If you don't have your repository set up correctly, or perhaps something I'm all too familiar with, if I've incorrectly registered my study and the utility can't locate the right area to store that data, it's gonna throw out an error message, and the file load utility will not succeed. So you need to make sure that that staging area is set up before you start to load data. So let's step through quickly, step by step, what the file load utility is actually going to do. First thing that happens is my vendor downloads a file to that secure staged area on the server. The back-end processing that is running on a regularly scheduled basis detects that that file has been loaded into that staging directory. It runs a set of pre-processing quality control checks. First thing it checks probably is the file name to make sure it follows the file name about. Study name, data type, data category, unique date time stamp. It checks to make sure that the format of the data file is correct. Make sure it's a valid SAS file, make sure it's a valid text file, whatever you've defined that file to be, make sure that that's valid. It also makes sure that that particular file has not previously been loaded, and it uses the date time stamp to determine that. There are quite a few other pre-processing checks I won't go into, but nonetheless it's pretty comprehensive. And until those pre-processing checks are complete, nothing else is going to happen. Once those quality control checks are all successfully completed, the data load utility starts its work. First thing it does is it extracts all of the SAS data sets or the text files, if that's what you have, extracts them all into that processing directory we discussed earlier. Next thing it does for each of those data sets or text files is extract the metadata for each of those. And by metadata, it extracts the information to define the structure in LSH. How many columns are there for the data set? What are the names of the columns? What are the SAS labels of the columns? What's the data type, the length, the precision? All of that information needs to be extracted for each of those data sets. The next thing it does is potentially verify the metadata for each of those data sets. If this is not the first load for that particular data file, then obviously the data structures are already there in LSH. And we need to make sure that the data structures for those prior loads are compatible with the current load. It's certainly possible that even though you've come to a common agreement with a vendor and that we understand that the data file is supposed to look like this and contain these data structures with these columns and these column types, it's always possible that something can go wrong and those data sets are no longer conforming to those criteria. So the metadata is compared to previous loads if there is a previous load. If there has been a previous load, either the new metadata must match the previous load, or if you set the options as you want during study registration and you allow compatible metadata updates, then the utility will process those compatible metadata updates. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a future slide. But I think this is perhaps one of the more distinguishing features of this file load utility, its ability to adapt over time and to apply changes to the data over time automatically without any manual intervention. So I think this is a very important feature. After the utility is continuing and all the data sets are correct and the metadata has been verified, LSH will create a load set for each of those data files. It will update the repository metadata if you set the option that way and if there has been a compatible change. It will then start each of those load sets. It starts them one by one. It monitors each of those load sets, monitoring them for errors and doing all kinds of interesting checks. And finally, another interesting feature of this particular file load utility is that it also records a lot of performance metrics as it's running. It's useful over time to understand, how long it took to load the data, how many records were inserted, how many records were updated, how the metadata was changed, all of those kinds of interesting facts which will allow us to understand our data a bit better. So this file load utility records those metrics and makes them available to us for our analysis. Finally, when the load utility is done, whether it's done successfully or whether there's been a failure, it will send out notifications to the users if any notifications have been defined, and those users will be able to respond to those notifications. If there are failures, the administrators can investigate them, If they're a success, then the study data managers know that new data is available for them. The results cover in the next couple of slides. I mentioned before, for efficiency's sake, the file load utility actually processes each of those data sets in parallel. So if you've received 20 data files or 20 data sets in a file, if you receive 50 data sets in a file, if you receive one data set in a file, those are all going to be processed in parallel so that you don't have to wait for the whole set to complete. You can start to do work with the data as the jobs are running. When the jobs are all done, the final result is that the data is loaded into that staging area in the warehouse. So you can see in the first half of this slide, you can see that there are a number of different load sets, one for each of the data sets that was loaded in from the data file. And you can see a number of tables, each of which will have the data that was loaded from the corresponding data set. And the best results are that we now have that data available for analysis. In this particular example, over at the left in that nice lavender hue, you can see that Typico Spotfire has prepared a very nice tree map for us so that we can analyze concomitant medications by indication. A very nice presentation, extremely useful. We also see another kind of analysis that's performed on lab results based on lab reference ranges. Again, it presents the information in a very useful fashion. And the nice thing is that those visualizations can be automatically made available as soon as the data is loaded and is available in the warehouse. So that data is loaded at noon, visualizations and analysis could be available as soon as the data is loaded later that afternoon. So I mentioned a couple times, what happens when the metadata changes? How do I manage that? In our ideal solution, we want that to happen automatically. We don't want to have to manually intervene when there are changes. So one of the options you can specify when you're setting up the study is whether or not to allow compatible changes to a table. And by compatible, the utility takes a conservative approach and says anything that will not potentially destroy data is a compatible change. So that increasing the length of a column is compatible. Increasing the precision of a numeric is compatible. Adding columns is compatible. Things that are not compatible are things which have the potential to destroy data, such as removing columns, decreasing column length, those kinds of things. So if I set that auto metadata change flag to yes, and the system detects compatible changes. For example, I need to add 2 additional columns to my demography table. The utility is going to process those changes automatically. It's going to detect, as we see here, that there are some new columns in the incoming file. It lists the columns as detected as new. It's determined that that's a compatible change. It automatically updates the table definition in LSH to include those 2 new columns, and it automatically starts to load data for those new columns. Absolutely no manual intervention is required. It all happens without you having to do anything. It's pretty obvious at this point that changes that are not compatible will require manual intervention, however. So there is a potential, if you need to make incompatible changes, you would have to go either work with your vendor to resolve those differences or make some changes manually in the LSH warehouse. So at the end here, I'd like to summarize and revisit the question we asked earlier about what our ideal utility is going to do for us and see if the utility is going to meet those criteria. So is the utility automated? And is it as hands-off as possible? I think we've seen that the system is automated. Once you do some fairly simple setup to define new data sources, the system will run by itself, receiving files, processing files, loading data, and sending out notifications. Only times someone would need to intervene would be if there were errors in the system or if needed to make manual changes in LSH. Is the system going to be flexible? So we saw that the system has a number of different options that let us specify how to handle every different type of file we might be receiving. We saw that it's flexible in that it allows us to adapt to changes in our data structures over time. Is the system going to be efficient and secure and reliable? Obviously, a lot of that depends on the repository you choose and some of the support that you provide to the utility. But on the whole, the utility does support efficiency by processing load sets in parallel. It does support security by making sure that only authorized users can access the data files and the data. So we've seen that it is efficient, secure, and reliable. Is the system simple to implement? I believe that you'll find this as easy to implement as most other solutions. Obviously, there's work that needs to be done by systems and network administrators. Obviously, study data managers need to keep on top of registering new studies and data types. But on the whole, there's not a whole lot to do after the system is initially installed and validated. And with that, I'm going to hand this back to Eugene for your questions, if there were any, and we'll let Eugene take over from there. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. I very much appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. That was excellent, very thorough. Just want to remind everybody that you are welcome to ask questions via the chat feature, which is at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So feel free to ask away. So we'll just move on to the questions. Catherine, if you can follow along on the questions tab, that might be helpful.
Okay.
So, and I'm not sure if this was a question or a comment, but feel free to address it. It was quality assurance, in parentheses, edit checks can be combined to load utility. I don't know if that was, can it be added? If that was a question or if that was just a comment. Feel free to.
I'll just comment in general. The file load utility currently is not concerned with the quality of data it receives, so that there are no edit checks built into the system on data quality. And the reasons for that should be kind of obvious. The file load utility doesn't know what kind of data it will be receiving. It could be receiving anything you throw at it. So it reserves the responsibility of verifying the data quality to study data managers after the data is loaded into LSH. Could those kinds of edit checks be built in? Only if you have fairly tight control probably over the kinds of data that you would potentially be receiving into the system.
Great, thank you. The next question is, can you load XML ODM files?
That's an excellent question. The current file load utility works with data file transfers, but the underlying functions and features of that system could be easily adapted to start receiving streaming data in addition to data files. So the underlying processes, the underlying logic could easily handle those. Does it do it today? The answer is no, but actually it's a good question because we are considering working on that in the future. We understand that XML ODM and streaming data is going to be the future of data load.
Great. Next question is, does the auto insertion of new columns get added to master metadata?
Is that, I'm reading, sorry. If I understand that correctly, the answer is yes. So if I've added those two new columns, the underlying table definitions in LSH are automatically updated by the utility to include those new column definitions. So if that's what you mean by master metadata, then yes, those underlying definitions are automatically updated.
All right, next question. Are you familiar with Oracle's Data Management Workbench, DMW, which I understand is built on LSH as its backend? Out of the box, does it implement many of the concepts and solutions presented in this webinar? Can DMW be utilized as a clinical data warehouse solution in the context discussed here?
It's a very complex question, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'll try to answer it as simply as possible. Yes, I'm familiar with DMW. I don't necessarily think DMW should be recognized as a data warehouse solution. It does provide many of the features and functions that we've talked about and some that we haven't talked about, but I don't believe that its main utility as a warehouse. It is not primarily built as a warehouse solution. It doesn't have some of the robust features that a clinical data warehouse should have. If you'd like to discuss that a little bit further, Eugene can direct you to the right resources at Perficient to dig into that data management workbench solution.
Great. And on the same note, we actually delivered a webinar, Mike Grossman did, several months ago. So feel free to email me at eugene.stefanov@perficient.com, and I can send you the link to that webinar. The next question is, will you receive a copy of this presentation? Yes, you will receive it within the next couple of days along with the link to the slides, so that will be taken care of. Next question is, where or how is the mapping done for incoming file structure to repository?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I'll answer as best I can. The file utility processing at the back end extracts the metadata, or the table definitions for each of those data sets, and it builds some internal structures and uses those internal structures to compare against incoming data files. I don't know if that specifically answers your question. If not, you could redirect it to Eugene again, who would redirect it to me again, and we'll try to answer you a little bit more completely.
Perfect. Next question has to do with pricing. So naturally I will not answer that, but you are welcome to contact us for more information. Next comment/question. I like the parallel loading feature, but can you schedule some data sets to be loaded ahead of others, especially when there are dependencies?
Mm-hmm. Good question. There is no feature right now in the utility to do that. So it probably processes them in the order in which they're extracted from the initial data file. So no, the answer is no. Interesting concept though, something for us to think about.
Okay, and the last question, and we can close it with that, is how much training is needed to become efficient? In order to register a new study, very little. An hour or two discussion on how to insert a new record into that table. Most of this is easy to use. Once that file is dropped into that stage directory, again, it is hands-off. There's no human intervention required. Perfect. We got through all the questions. You guys are welcome to follow us online. We have various social media accounts. We blog. You can visit our life sciences specific blog at the link and address below. I'd like to invite everybody also to an upcoming presentation that we have coming up at Oracle Open World. This is in late October in San Francisco, so if you happen to be attending the event, please do visit our presentations that will take place there. One last thing is somebody just quickly asked for my email address. That's eugene.stefanov@perficient.com, and I just thought about it. I will write it in the text box below. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending this presentation. Catherine, great job, excellent information, and we look forward to having you soon. Thank you so much for your time.